Hi, everybody. It's Miss Amanda. I'm your host today for our final family concert of July. We are so excited that you are here today. We are thrilled to be able to offer these family concerts to you in your home on the last Sunday of every month. The concert today is really exciting because we're going to be sharing about a really cool instrument family in the symphony, the woodwinds. The woodwinds sit in the middle of the symphony, and they are very important roles to play. You can see where they sit in this image. They're right in the middle. The four main instruments are the flute, clarinet, oboe, and bassoon. There are a few more that are similar to those, like the piccolo, the bass clarinet, and contrabassoon. But today we're going to focus on the primary four. I'm so pleased to be joined by our Principal Woodwind section of the Des Moines Symphony. They will join us and answer questions for you and play their instruments. If you have questions during the live stream, be sure to ask below. We'll be playing those, gathering them, and compiling them and answering at the end. My special guests today are James Blanchard, Principal Flute. Then we have Jennifer Wohlenhaus, Principal Oboe. Greg Oates, Principal Clarinet. And Kevin Judge, our Principal Bassoonist. All right, I'm excited. I hope you're excited, so let's get started. Our first musician I'd like to introduce to you is Mr. James Blanchard, who plays the flute. Mr. James currently lives in California. He is originally from New Mexico, and he also lived in New York City, where he attended the famous Juilliard School of Music. Music is such a wonderful vehicle to see the entire world. Mr. James, can you tell us a bit about the flute?
Thanks, Amanda. So this is the flute, and despite it being called a woodwind, it is made entirely of metal. This part, called the head joint, is made of gold, and then this part, which is called the body, is made of sterling silver. And the way that I play it is, I blow across this hole right here, like you would exactly on a Coke bottle, and then I also press my fingers down on these keys that make the sound go either lower or higher, depending on if I put more of my fingers down or if I take all of my fingers off. So as you can hear, it can play so many notes all at once, and when I first heard the flute, I knew exactly that was the voice I wanted to have with an instrument.
Thank you, James. Does anybody have a Coke bottle like this? Let's try to see if we can play like the flute does. That sounds pretty cool. I bet you if you were to add some water to yours maybe after the concert, it's going to make a different pitch. So, how interesting is that when you put your fingers down on the flute that the sound goes up or down? It's very, very cool. Mr. James, thank you for showing us that. We do have a video question that I'd love your help answering.
How old were you when you started playing the flute?
I was in 5th grade, much like many of you are right now, and I went to the local band camp where I was growing up, and I heard the demonstrations for the beginners, and the flute player played a solo from Peter and the Wolf by Prokofiev. And I remember hearing just how brilliantly and quickly he was able to play, and it changed my life from that moment on. Obviously, I still love the flute, I'm still playing it, and I can't wait to get back to playing it with everyone else in the orchestra.
Wow, that's great. You know, I just love the flute, and I'm excited because I think Mr. James is going to give us an example of that piece here in a little bit. Now, before we do that, though, I do believe that we have another question from my friend Boris.
Was it hard to learn the flute?
I will say that it did come pretty naturally to me at first. I worked really hard at the beginning and still work very hard at getting better always, but it's always been a complete joy to learn how to play the flute and how to get better. And yeah, I think it's an incredible instrument, and I think that it has an incredible place in the orchestra alongside everyone else. So with all that said, I'd love to play for you the excerpt that changed my life, and hopefully I'll be able to change some of yours. It's the same solo from Peter and the Wolf that I heard 20 years ago or so. No, 15 years ago, I think. Here we go. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope all of you are staying safe and healthy during these crazy times. And I hope that I get to see all of you again sometime soon. And I hope that the orchestra will be getting back to normal and playing as soon as possible. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. James. I love the story that he shared where the piece that he played by Prokofiev influenced him so much when he was a young person that it's still one of his favorite pieces 20 years later. I think it's really cool that music can tell a story and touch a person's heart like that. So thank you for sharing that story, Mr. James. Did you guys know that the flute plays in the treble clef? Now, not only does it play in the treble clef, but also the clarinet and the oboe also play in the treble clef. Kind of like the violin. So do you know by chance what clef the bassoon would play in? If you guess the bass clef, you're right. That's so exciting. So the bass clef, like the bassoon, is also used for music for the cello and the bass, which are our stringed instruments in the string family. Now, we are going to move on. Since we've just learned a little bit about the flute, now I think it's time that we should learn about the oboe. Now, next we're going to hear from Dr. Jennifer Wohlenhaus, who plays the oboe in the Des Moines Symphony as our principal oboist. Dr. Jennifer, you might be surprised, is not a doctor of medicine, but she is a doctor of music, which means she's been studying the oboe for a really long time. So we'd call her an expert. Now, she went to Drake University here in Des Moines. She also went to school at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, which is also in California, and the University of Iowa. She started playing the flute in 5th grade and switched to the oboe in 7th grade. So you can change your mind. That's pretty cool. I'm ready to learn about the oboe. Are you?
The oboe is a double reed instrument, which means there are 2 pieces of cane put together to make the reed. It mostly plays higher notes in the orchestra, like the violin or maybe the trumpet in the brass section. It sounds like this. The lowest note it can play is this. One of the highest notes it can play is this. But usually it plays somewhere in between the two. One of the most important things that it does is tune the orchestra. When the concertmaster stands up and turns around, I play an A. And then the whole orchestra tunes. First the winds and brass, and then the strings.
That is so cool. Did you know that the oboe tuned the orchestra? Now, the concertmaster, the guy that she mentioned, guy or lady, is the person that stands up at the very, very beginning. It's the first chair violinist. And they stand up and they give a nod to our principal oboist. She plays her A, all of the strings tune, and then all of the woodwinds and brass then tune as well. Do the percussionists need to tune? Some of them. Tune in at a later date to find out if the percussionists tune their instruments too. All right, moving on. Now, Dr. Jennifer told us that the oboe is a double reed instrument. Most woodwinds use reeds, minus the flute. My cat is playing the piano right now. But did you know, ad-libbing, which is really fun, But did you know that oboists and bassoonists use 2 reeds? So what's really cool is Miss Jennifer is going to be showing us how they do that because they have to make their own. So let's take a closer look. Dr. Jennifer is going to show us now.
The oboe is a double reed instrument, just like the bassoon is too. Part of what oboists and bassoonists have to do is make reeds. When you make reeds, you start with a piece of cane that looks like a tube. It's then split into thirds, in my case, for oboe reeds. It's different for bassoon reeds. And then it's kind of hollowed out or gouged, and then it's shaped. As you can see, it's starting to look a little bit like an oboe reed. Then it's tied on to a metal staple that looks like this. And then finally, it's scraped with a knife and turned into a reed. And here's a finished reed. And I'll let you see what it looks like to look down it. See if you can see through it. See those 2 blades? That tiny little space is where all the air goes to make the sound on the oboe. Oboists soak their reeds in water for a few minutes before they play. The water helps make the cane a little softer and makes it more easy to vibrate. An oboe reed won't work very well if it isn't soaked, and water is the best thing to soak it in.
That's so interesting. You know, I am fascinated with the oboe. Do you have any questions about the oboe or a double reed instrument? Don't forget to leave your questions below and we'll be sure to answer them for you at the end of the concert. Now, I believe that we have a couple of video questions from my friends, Jedrick.
How often do you practice the oboe? How long have you been playing the oboe?
I practice the oboe every day, and that's an important thing to do anyway, but it's especially crucial right now because I purchased a new oboe last September. And with an oboe, you must play it in small increments at a time to break it in. So I add about 5 minutes a week. And about the time that we started having to stay home was about the time that it was done and ready to be played all the time. But right now it's especially crucial that I play it absolutely every day to keep it breaking in.
That's really interesting. I didn't know you had to break in an oboe. Since I'm a violinist, I do know that you have to break in new strings for a violin or any other string instrument, so I find it fascinating that the oboe, if it's new, also needs to be broken in. Here's our next question.
How old were you when you started to play the oboe?
I was 13 when I started to play the oboe. Before playing the oboe, I played the flute for 2 years. In my hometown, we started on a core group of instruments and then were moved to other instruments like the oboe or the bassoon later when we were a little older. Before I played the flute, I played the piano. When I was age 5, I started taking piano and have played ever since. I still have my first oboe. This is my first oboe. And then this is my current oboe. As you can see, my first oboe has fewer keys, and some of those keys don't have holes in them, versus my current oboe, which has a lot of keys and some holes in those keys too. The reason for this with my older oboe is to make it easier for beginners to cover and close those keys as they're learning to play.
I find that really, really interesting. I love being able to see her first oboe and the oboe that she currently uses. I think that's really great. Thanks to Jedrick and Boris for sending us those questions. Don't forget, if you guys have questions and you'd like to be featured on a video just like Jedrick and Boris, that you can send us to those anytime, and I promise we'll share them in one of our upcoming family concerts. Now, Dr. Jennifer is going to play a little bit of Peter and the Wolf, which is the same piece that Mr. James played on the flute earlier. What's really cool about Peter and the Wolf is that the composer, Prokofiev, actually wrote these instruments to sound like animals. What instrument do you think that the oboe is going to sound like? Do you think it's going to sound like an elephant? Do you think it might sound like a cat? Who knows? I bet that Dr. Jennifer is going to show us what the instrument sounds like. Here she comes.
Today I'm going to play a few excerpts from Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf. In Peter and the Wolf, the oboe plays the part of the duck. Here's a little bit where we run into some trouble with the cat. The cat is after the bird and the duck. And so the bird flies up in the tree to get away from the cat, and I go to the pond.
If you guys closed your eyes during that, could you imagine the duck waddling to the lake or swimming and paddling with its feet? I could. Did you guess that it was a duck that the oboe would sound like? If you did, that's excellent. Congratulations, you were right. Miss Jennifer is going to play one more bit for us.
In this excerpt, the duck is being chased by the wolf. In this last excerpt, the oboe plays up a little bit higher because this excerpt is meant to be played from the duck inside the wolf's tummy because he swallows the duck whole.
Wow, I just love, love, love the oboe. When the duck was getting chased by a wolf, could you imagine it running rather than waddling down to the lake like it was before, but this time it was pattering down like, I don't know, maybe a dirt path or something? I think it's really excellent that instruments and composers can come together and make music that sounds like animals. I think it's fascinating. Thank you, Dr. Jennifer, for sharing that wonderful music with us. Next up, our next instrument is the bassoon, which is played by Kevin Judge, our principal bassoonist. Kevin studied at the University of Iowa and is now on faculty at Iowa State University. In just a few minutes, Mr. Kevin is going to be teaching us how to make bassoon reeds. Remember, they're the double reeds like the oboe. So this is the time where you can go ahead and get your supplies ready if you want to join us in making bassoon reeds together. Now, you'll need a bit of string or some tape. You'll need a couple of flat things. I don't know, like I have painter strips. You could even have just one or the other. You can have pencils. Any of it works. So those are the materials that you'll need for the activity later on in Mr. Kevin's presentation. Mr. Kevin, will you tell us a little bit about the bassoon?
Thank you, Amanda. Well, I'm here to show you the largest and lowest instrument in the woodwind family, the bassoon. But don't be fooled, because it can play pretty high too.
Wow, that's really cool. What else can you teach us about the bassoon?
I want to introduce you to the instrument and how I create sound while playing. Basically, since it's a woodwind instrument, I blow through this reed, which has two blades that vibrate against each other, that creates a sound that travels through this metal bocal into this wing joint. Then it goes down and connects into this boot joint. There's a U-tube at the bottom, a different kind of U-tube than you're thinking, that brings the sound back up the boot joint into the longest joint called the long joint. And then it finally the sound comes out through the bell, which is so big, it's hard to even show you on screen, but this is the inside of the bell. And when all the keys and when all the holes are covered, you get to play the lowest note that comes out of the bell. Pretty cool sound, right?
I love that sound. It's so low. It kind of sounds like a big boat horn or something like that. A couple of interesting facts about Mr. Kevin is that he was actually in the Des Moines Symphony Academy's youth orchestras when he was a kid. That's super fascinating, which means that he started with the Academy and now he's playing with the Des Moines Symphony. I think that story is really interesting. Mr. Kevin, could you tell us about the keys on the bassoon?
So sound is created when different holes are covered on the bassoon, and as you cover a hole, the instrument gets longer, and as the instrument gets longer, the notes go lower. So just listen here as I cover these 3 holes that you can see, and you'll notice how the pitch tends to get lower and lower. So there's a few different holes that are on the bassoon in both my right hand and the left hand. All 10 fingers are either covering a hole or playing a key. And the keys are a lot on the back side of the instrument. And one of my keys, my left thumb plays all 9 of those keys right there. So I'm really, really good at thumb work. But as you play those different keys and you press them down and cover different holes, different sounds are made. And then that's how we can have an instrument that is low and at the same time can play very high notes.
That is so cool. Can you believe it? Can you imagine, like, do this for just a little bit. Can you imagine playing 9 different keys with one thumb? That's a lot of work. I bet that's kind of tricky. Now, before we move on to our video questions, in a little bit, as you know, we're going to be doing an activity with learning how to build the bassoon reeds. Now, before we start that, I want you to think about, what do you think the reeds are made out of? I'd love to see your comments below. Now, if you think that they're made out of popsicle sticks, or if you think they're made out of a tree, or anything else, I would love to know what you think the bassoon reeds are made out of. Coming up next, we have a couple of questions from our friends.
We have a lot of great questions from you all, and I want to dive right into them.
How old were you when you started to play the bassoon?
I was 11 and a half when I first started playing the bassoon, and I keep playing every day, try and get better and better at my instrument, at the craft, and I haven't looked back. It's very rewarding, a lot of fun.
Was it hard for you to carry the bassoon when you were younger?
It was a little difficult when I first started playing to lug the instrument back and forth from school to home every day to practice, but it built up my arms. I got a little stronger, and it wasn't the worst. I wouldn't let that be an obstacle for anybody trying to learn.
Do you think playing the bassoon will help you play other instruments like the oboe?
I think playing any instrument will help you learn any other instrument. It's kind of like a language. If you learn Spanish, you'd be amazed at how much easier it is to learn French and German, any other language, just because you understand language structure a little bit. So I think learning instruments is kind of similar to that. I was lucky enough to start on the piano, and then I played saxophone, and then kept playing the bassoon. So I was able to play the bassoon better and pick it up quicker because of my experience with those other instruments.
Did you have to learn a different instrument before you were allowed to do the bassoon?
So before I played the bassoon, I had to play the saxophone. I played piano for years before that. I started playing piano when I was in 2nd grade. It wasn't a requirement that I played another instrument before the bassoon, but it is just so much harder because you use all 10 fingers, you read bass clef instead of treble clef. The fingerings are much different. You have to make your own reeds. There's a lot of challenges with the bassoon. So I think it does help if you have another instrument and again, you understand that structure of music. That'll make you a better bassoon player when you do start performing.
Did someone inspire you to play the bassoon?
Luckily, I have had many great band directors and orchestra directors, and they have all inspired me to play the bassoon and keep playing it every day and strive to do my best. But my very first band director, Mrs. Mary Dunn Hayward, was my biggest inspiration because she introduced me to the instrument. So yes, I was fortunate enough to have a great band director who introduced me to the bassoon. Those are all great questions, and I hope I can answer more for you in the future.
Thanks, Mr. Kevin, and to all of our students who submitted those video questions. Those were excellent. Now, I was wondering, to the audience who's listening now, do you have any idea how old Mr. Kevin's bassoon might be? Take some guesses, comment below, and we'll check in later to see if you're right. All right, Mr. Kevin, I think we're ready to hear some instrument demonstrations. Would you play some music for us now?
Okay, so now we move over to the reed desk where I make bassoon reeds, which is what I play on. That is what I blow into and creates a sound. I'll do that right now. Kind of sounds like a duck call, doesn't it? And believe it or not, this final product, the bassoon reed, is made from this, a piece of cane, a rundodonax is the technical term. So I wanted to show you one of the finishing stages of making a bassoon reed. Can you tell me what the difference is between these two pieces of cane? This one has hot glue on it, doesn't it? At the very bottom. It's a little more bright, more colorful. Other than that, they're pretty similar. They have two wires right here, and then even this one has a third wire that gets covered up by the hot glue eventually. But what the reed is, it's made out of two pieces of cane that are attached, and the wires keep things together, and so does the hot glue. So you can see this is one side, that's one side of the reed. This is the other side of the reed. And that's separation right there. You can kind of see. And that's the part that you blow into. This is the part, the bottom right there, that fits into the bocal on the bassoon. So I thought it would kind of be fun to make our own bassoon reeds using household items. And if you have two popsicle sticks, two paintbrushes, two pencils like I have right here, these are going to resemble a piece of cane, all right? So we can take these two pencils, put them together, and instead of a wire, I thought tape might work well to put these two together.
I've got mine ready, and my tape. Are you ready to join us for making your own instrument reeds at home?
So I'm going to wrap 3 pieces of tape around these two pencils. 1, 2, 3 pieces of tape. And that resembles the 3 wires that are found on this piece of cane, on this reed. And then finally, instead of the hot glue that I use, which I'll show you in a second, I thought it'd be fun to use string. This is our colorful string that you can wrap really fast, as fast as you can. It's a race, who can do it the quickest, around. And that really secures the reed to make sure that those 2 pieces of cane don't go anywhere. And when it's all said and done, we have something that's very similar to the bassoon reed. You just made your own homemade bassoon reed. Except if you try and blow into this end, it's not going to make any sound. This does. All right, so I wanted to show you on this one piece of cane here what it would be like if I were to put hot glue on it. So I need one piece of equipment. And I have my hot glue gun right here. This could be deceiving. It looks like I might be making an orange reed, but there's brown hot glue in there, so it actually might turn out brown. But if we're lucky, we'll get streaks of orange in it too. So I have to concentrate when I'm doing this so I don't get hot glue everywhere. You know, and I said you could make over your pencils or popsicle sticks, you could use yarn. There's a whole array of things, household items that you could use to make a bassoon reed. You might use tape. Your tape might end up being what substitutes for the hot glue. So it's kind of like arts and crafts. You know, when I first started playing the bassoon, nobody ever told me that I was going to have arts and crafts time. But it is. Every reed is unique and different, and you have to make them in order to play on it. So that is my finished reed.
That is so interesting. Mr. Kevin's pretty funny, especially when he tried to play into his pencil reeds. That didn't make any sound, did it? Mr. Kevin, that was awesome. Thanks for teaching us how to make your reeds for the bassoon. Now, we have talked so much about the bassoon that now I want to remember what it sounds like again. So, like I said earlier, I was so excited for Mr. Kevin to play for us, and here he comes now with his beautiful music.
A composer that wrote for the bassoon really well, that I want to play a few excerpts from, was Mozart. So you might be familiar with him. This first excerpt is from the opening of the Marriage of Figaro opera. He also wrote a bassoon concerto, and it's a solo for bassoon and orchestra. So I'm going to play a little bit of the first and second movement for you. And then this is from the second movement of that same concerto. The piece is a little slower.
Mr. Kevin, that was excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your gift of music on the bassoon with us, for sharing your information on how to make bassoon reeds, and so much more. We really enjoyed spending time with you today. Our last musician that we're going to be hanging out with today is Mr. Greg Oakes. Mr. Greg has performed all around the world, from Berlin to Brazil and Thailand. And just like Mr. Kevin, he's also a faculty member at Iowa State University. What is faculty? That's like a teacher. So somebody who's at your school is kind of a faculty member for your school. So they're a teacher at Iowa State University. He's going to join us right now to answer some questions that we have come in during the concert and more.
Hi there.
Hi, Mr. Greg. How are you doing today?
Doing great.
Awesome. We're so excited to have you today. Clarinet's one of my favorite instruments, and I love hearing jazz music, especially for clarinet. I think it's really interesting that it can play so many different genres. Would you possibly give us a demonstration on your clarinet?
Absolutely.
That was excellent. Wow, that's a lot of fun. Now, is there anything else you'd want to tell us about your clarinet, like about the keys or the wood or anything like that?
Sure. The color of the instrument is the key. This is actually what the very good grow. It's called Interior or African Blackwood. And this is actually the color of it. And it looks like maybe it's been painted, but it grows with that color. And it's very, very hard to fit. The instrument has 16 different keys on it, and it also has 6 rings. These things right here, but I think that it also shows so, with different combinations, just like we were doing about the tune, we add more fingers and make it lower. But then I can play both low and high. So that's the
range of what's going on with the clarinet. We hear a rather large gamut of sounds. The thing that makes the sounds on the clarinet is similar to bassoon and oboe. It's a reed, but unlike the other double reed instruments that have two parts that vibrate against each other, this one is a single reed. You can see that, and this thing vibrates back and forth up against this part here, the mouthpiece, and that's what makes the sound. Every sound is just vibrations that start in the instrument and go through the air, and so so that's the clarinet, and of course all of these woodwind instruments are hollow on the inside, and so if you could look through there, you would be actually, if I take this off, you could see all the way through. You could see there all the way through the other wall, and so the clarinet is kind of the newest woodwind in the orchestra. The bassoon, oboe, flute were all in the orchestra before the clarinet. And the clarinet was a brand new instrument about the time that Mozart was writing music. And so we didn't have it in some of the older music. If you were to hear something by Vivaldi or something by Handel, clarinet didn't exist yet.
Wow, that's all fascinating. So, Mr. Greg, just to clarify, you said that your instrument was made out of African blackwood. Is that correct?
Yes.
I mean, how do they harvest that? Like, how long does it take to make an oboe? How long does an oboe last?
Yeah, and oboes are made of the same wood, by the way, too. That's right. Yeah, oboes and clarinets are made of this same thing. They harvest this wood. It grows in Africa, and it takes a very, very long time to grow. And so the people will cut down these trees and sell the pieces of wood to the companies that make my clarinet, for example, is made in France. And so they will sell pieces of this wood in long chunks to the companies named Buffet. And Buffet makes clarinets. They also make saxophones and oboes too. And so the instrument starts out that way, and they take the wood and they let it cure and sit. It's a long process that starts with letting the wood age.
Oh, interesting. You know, I have a ton of questions myself, but I definitely know that we have some student questions too. So let's hear from our students for you.
What made you decide you wanted to play clarinet?
What made me decide to play the clarinet? I love this story. My very first instrument actually was the piano. And I had played it. My aunt was a piano teacher, and I just really wanted to play an instrument. But I also wanted to play in band. And I had the band director at the local high school in the summer gave us all an opportunity to try out all the different instruments. I thought I was going to play trombone. My dad had one in the closet, but it turns out I couldn't make a very good sound on the trombone. But clarinet, I could play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star right away because I already knew what it sounded like. And the fingers. It was easy. It was all in one hand, and it kind of made sense, similar to the piano. So ever since then, I've been playing the clarinet.
That's awesome. The clarinet sound is really, it's very warm to me. It's a really beautiful sound. We have actually another question from Jedrick.
Why is the clarinet your favorite instrument?
Why is the clarinet my favorite instrument? This instrument has so many different extremes that it can do. It can play very, very softly. I'm going to see if you can hear this. And really loudly. It can do really low sounds and very high sounds. And the clarinet also can make some really unusual sounds. And the flexibility and the contrast in all the different possible sounds the instrument makes, I really enjoy. And just like Amanda was saying too, the warmth of the instrument, that we call that the timbre, I really enjoy too.
Awesome. Actually, another friend, Boris, has a question that I think is a great follow-up to this.
Besides the clarinet, what's your favorite instrument?
Yeah. Besides the clarinet, I love the cello. Cello, if you don't already know, is a string instrument. It's a bigger version of the violin, and it has another really beautiful, warm, soothing kind of sound that also can be really exciting. If you haven't been to the symphony and had a chance to hear cellos in person, they're the ones that are on your right side on the stage, and people play it in between their legs, and it's got a really great sound. So that's a lot of fun to listen to.
That makes sense that you would also like the cello, because I think that warmth that I mentioned earlier is a very similar relationship between the two. Even though you play in treble clef and they play in bass clef, that warmth I think is a unique characteristic.
It's true. And as long as we're talking about the low instruments, I've actually brought another instrument along to show you. This might be a good time to talk about it. So this is the clarinet. We also call it the soprano clarinet because it plays in the treble clef, as we were just talking about. And the sounds, it's kind of in the same range as the flute, and maybe sometimes a little bit lower. So you see this one now, the bass clarinet. This is going to come on stage, kind of like Star Wars. Here we go. It is really long, still going. We're not done yet. There's the bottom of it. This is a big instrument, and the bigger an instrument is, the lower it sounds. Remember we talked about the bassoon. The bassoon had really low sounds because it's so long. The bass clarinet is similar to that. Quite a bit different sound from the soprano clarinet.
The bass clarinet, that's really exciting that we got to hear one of those extra instruments that was in the initial introduction of this concert. We've had a lot of conversations so far, but I do believe, I think that you have something prepared for us to play, and then we can follow up with some more questions at the end to make sure that we're answering everybody's questions in the chat.
Great, we'll do that. So, we know the story of Peter and the Wolf, the piece by Sergei Prokofiev. I love how Peter and the Wolf uses the different instruments to show different characteristics. And if you don't already know the story, the cat in the story is played by the clarinet. And so I think that this is a great thing that we get the character of the animal and the instrument kind of matched up. So here is what I'm going to move my camera a little bit so you can see my instrument better. Here is what the cat sounds like when we first meet him in Peter and the Wolf. So that cat is creeping around, catching the bird, he hopes. And so he gets a little bit more excited. I mentioned earlier that I really like the contrast of the clarinet. And in the story, there's contrast too. So there's the cat kind of stealthily creeping forward. There's another part in the story where the cat runs up the tree. You know how cats are. Sometimes they're kind of hanging out and meow, man, all right. And then sometimes they're right burning right out the door, right? Well, the cat gets a chance to do that in Peter and the Wolf too. And at the end, the cat ends up in the tree, hanging out far away from the wolf, who he was running away from.
We're talking about the cat, and that the cat was the character, because earlier in the concert, my cat made a surprise appearance playing the piano. So cats are definitely very mischievous animals, and the fact that it's very immediately presented, you know, in your performance, I think that was perfect. So excellent choice for performance on that. Yeah, you know, Mr. Greg, that was excellent. You know, if anybody has any questions for Mr. Greg or for me to answer, we'd be happy to do so. So I'll ask a couple. Mr. Greg, do you, do you teach anything besides the clarinet, or do you play anything else besides the clarinet?
You know, I used to play a few different instruments. As I mentioned, played piano was my first instrument, like Mr. Kevin. And also used to play saxophone, same thing, although I played clarinet before I played saxophone. Now I primarily play the clarinet. You saw the bass clarinet that I play, occasionally too, but I don't really teach any other instruments. It's a pretty specialized world we're in, although I did bring another little surprise to show. So we had the really low, cool sounds of the bass clarinet, and I know there's just one person out there who's like, okay, so is there anything that's higher? There it is, the piccolo clarinet. This instrument, you can see, is about 2/3 the size of this instrument. Piccolo clarinet, also sometimes called the E-flat clarinet, it's just the key that it plays in. And so it has a different sound in addition to being higher. And so we use this instrument in the orchestra to give some character, and it can really stand out over the whole group. Really high.
That's crazy. So how often, is it ever a thing where you have to switch between all three instruments in one piece?
It's not super common, but it is occasionally something that happens. More of the time, the person who plays bass clarinet in the orchestra will play some on the soprano clarinet, the first one I play. If there is something on the piccolo clarinet, the E-flat clarinet, that person will sometimes play something on the soprano clarinet. On some symphonies by Mahler, for example. I have played a Mahler symphony in which I had to play bass clarinet and soprano clarinet and piccolo clarinet all in one part, but that's really unusual.
That would be kind of challenging, especially being able to make sure you have the right music at the right time, or maybe do they combine it? Do they combine the music if you have to do that, or are you actually switching between different parts?
Yeah. One piece of music that just says in there, switch now, switch now, switch now. One of the harder parts that might not be obvious is that in order for these reeds to work well, they have to be soaked in water. And so we have little caps that we put on top of our mouthpiece to keep the reed from drying out. So if you're at the symphony and you are looking down into the clarinet section, you might see, if we're not playing for a little while, that we have these little caps on there. And that's why, because the reed has to have some moisture in it in order for it to be able to vibrate well.
That's great. It was interesting because Miss Jennifer earlier showed us that she keeps her reeds wet before she plays in a little glass of water. Do clarinetists do that as well?
Here's mine.
Great. Excellent. That's cool. And you don't have to do you just do that before you play for the entire concert, or is that something that you have to do even at intermission?
Yeah. At intermission, I take my reed off of my mouthpiece and I put it into a case, and then I soak it in the water once again and put it back on. And this reed, just the way this goes on here, this thing that holds it on is called a ligature. It basically is just the thing that holds that reed on, and the reed is just this piece of it's the same kind of cane that Mr. Kevin was talking about. It's made out of the exact same material, and the difference is the back of this is flat, and so it goes right up against this flat mouthpiece. You can see there too. You can see that hole inside the mouthpiece, and that's where the air goes between the reed and the mouthpiece, and then down into the instrument. And so when I put it on there, you can see. Whereas without that, there's nothing to vibrate. The reed's the thing that vibrates, so you always have to have that on there for it to make a sound.
Wow, that's a lot of really interesting information. Is there anything that maybe I haven't thought about or that we haven't seen in the comments yet that you think would be interesting for our audience to know about one or all three of the clarinets?
Well, let's see. The interesting thing about the clarinet is it does, as you talked about, have this sort of dual role as an orchestral instrument and as a jazz instrument. And so the interesting thing is the same exact instrument can be used for both of those things. As you noticed at the beginning, you can play jazz, you can play classical music. I play some jazz. I don't really teach jazz. That's a very specialized thing for people who dedicate their whole life to that kind of thing. But I do play a little bit once in a while. I think one of the most interesting things that I was talking about a moment ago is that there are a few different sounds that might not be obvious on the clarinet. Sometimes we call these things extended techniques. Normally when we hear the clarinet, we just hear one sound at a time. But there is a possibility to hear more than one sound at a time. It's called a multiphonic. I'm playing and I'm making two sounds at the same time through my instrument. And there's a bunch of different kinds of these things. It's not exactly the same as pushing two keys on a piano keyboard, but it is different from hearing just one note at a time. And so that's one of my favorite sounds on the clarinet. There's also the possibility of playing notes that are in between the regular notes, like on the piano keyboard. If we were to play every key going down the piano keyboard, you'd hear something like That's called the chromatic scale. On the clarinet, we can also play notes that are halfway in between each one of those. And those are called microtones. That's something that I also really enjoy playing on the clarinet. And they can be quite lovely, even though we're not always used to hearing those. Those are sounds that might get used in the classical music from India sometimes. Also in Persian music gets used quite a bit too. So we have this idea that the notes on the piano are the only ones that exist, and there are more of them out there too.
I really love that you mentioned that the different tones that it can make, especially music from all over the world. Where typically we're used to hearing the natural tones or the normal tone. I want to say normal, for what we're typically hearing. The keys on the piano. And so I really appreciate that you introduced the tones, the semitones in between those as well. I think that's really great. Thank you for that. Now, we are about ready to wrap up here. So, Mr. Greg, before we leave, are there any recommendations that you have for students on how to pick an instrument? If they're fascinated by all of the woodwinds, is there anything that you would suggest if they're going into school and being able to have the opportunity to play in band, how they would choose their instrument?
Sure. Probably the best thing is if you have an idea of something that you would like to play, try it out. That's what I did. I got a chance to try out some things. And that's really the main thing that we get to do is, listen, hear the sounds that you enjoy. If you like the way something sounds, you'll probably enjoy playing it. And realize that it takes time and it takes daily repetition to get good on an instrument. Because when you first play it, it won't sound as beautiful as the sounds that you heard on YouTube. I sure didn't, but keep at it. Like anything, with practice and consistency, it'll get better. So whatever you choose, give yourself a good amount of time working with it before you decide if you are actually liking the sounds you get, because you'll discover that you're enjoying it more and more the more you do it.
That's awesome advice. Thank you. One of the things that I tell my students is that practice makes things easier. So when you practice, the sound becomes easier. The effort to make that beautiful sound becomes a little less labored. And so that's one of the things too that we suggest for our students in the beginning strings program and at the academy, is that just to give it a try, but also commit to trying it for a while to make sure if you really, that you're investigating the instrument enough so that you have an educated response to your choices. So
Absolutely.
Thank you again so much. We are going to go ahead and wrap up our concert. We are about a minute away from 5 o'clock. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. Thank you, Mr. Greg, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, for those of you who are still with us, I do want to remind you that we are offering our family concerts the last Sunday of every month. The next concert is going to be really exciting. You're going to have to wait. It's a secret for right now because we're not ready to release all that fun information yet. But we have some great partnerships coming up, and we hope that you tune in again in August. Thank you. I enjoyed being your host today. My name is Miss Amanda, and we'll see you again soon. Have a great week.